Mm.
Hello and welcome to Lands Unknown. Just going to wait for some folks to fill up.
Good morning.
Absolutely delicious Copen map. I think that was the first thing we collaborated on before this.
Effectively, yeah, I just
Yeah.
had some um, difficulties with what I was doing, so I just sent you a whole bunch of questions, and you set me straight.
Yeah. Well, and I think the especially what is it? Well, like pressure systems and wind systems.
Yeah,
Um,
that really just
mhm.
went over my head.
Yeah. Oh wow, there we go. People are here. Fantastic.
Excellent.
This is, of course, my first weekend streaming or doing anything on YouTube, so I'm just gonna
Yeah, me too. Me too.
check.
I've never done a proper live stream before this point. I really jumped in the deep end because this is my seventh live stream of the weekend.
Wow, that is a lot.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how I kind of accidentally signed up for quite a lot of them, but yeah, this will be the fourth live stream of the format of someone more qualified than me in a particular subject who teaches me something interesting.
Well, next time we'll have to talk about biology, and I'll have to
Mm.
explore the biogeographical regions that are not related to my monitoring megafauna,
Oh, I would very happily join for something like that.
because yeah, I don't even know what I do, but they essentially have been doing their own thing. They don't have to be mammalian. Um, yeah, they've been doing their own thing for like 100 million years or so. So it'd be something very interesting to look at.
Cool, lots of possibilities.
Yeah. All right. I think we're ready to get started. Looks like we've
Cool.
got over 40 folks in here now. All right. Hello, my name is Will, and welcome to Lands Unknown. Today, we're going to be exploring TIRA 292B with Biblaridion as a part of the Worldbuilding Festival, and we're going to be developing states and other polities as the neotechs um, start to socially develop through, I suppose, their lithic period.
Hmm.
And how this is going to work is first, Bib is going to introduce Tira and kind of look over the different cultural areas that we're going to talk about today. We've got the map up here. Oh, map up here um, on the slides. Then I'm going to go through and talk about what a state is, what a polity is, um, whether states are inevitable, what a city is, and if cities are necessary for state building. And then we're going to kind of return to Tira and put all that together.
Hmm. Madeline is somewhat here.
Ah, breakfast after the last stream. That's true. I think Madeline has been up since quite early, her time. Jake, a state is whatever I'm in. Yes. Mhm. So,
Right.
and yeah, it's 5 a.m. for me. So if I'm a little off, that's the
Yeah. Yes, that I think under the circumstances is perfectly excusable if we take things a bit slow and chill.
yeah.
I think that's kind of the vibe of the whole festival,
Hmm.
um, which is good. I like this kind of free form stuff. So I do not have very much prepared, I have to say. Just an overview of what I've worked out so far, and then we'll just sort of see how things play out. So, shall I just launch into it?
Go for it.
Cool. So, first of all, if you don't know me, hello. Um, I am Biblaridion. But you can call me Bib for short. I admit that name has far too many syllables to make a good YouTube handle, but it's too late to change it now. Um, and I, on my channel for the past 5 years at this point, which is just madness, I have been working on a big flagship series called Alien Biospheres, which has just, well, I say just concluded. It finished last year, but more or less came to a culmination with the evolution of a sapient species, however you choose to define sapient, um, that will be capable of behaviors that are comparable, at least in some ways, to humans. And that brings us into a new series that I am currently planning, the first episode of which is almost done and should be hopefully completely finished within a month or so. I promise I am still working on it. I hit a little bit of a roadblock last month, but that's fine. And so, as I've said several times in this stream before, I am a biologist. I consider myself a double specialist, although that's a bit of a strong word. I know some things about biology and linguistics. I don't know much about anything else. And so far, I've only just kind of dipped my toe in the social sciences, and there's a lot about it that is still kind of mystifying to me. And so I do not feel anywhere near confident enough to present what few ideas I have in terms of the social dynamics and politics and governments that these creatures make. So that is why, very thankfully, Will has offered to help. He also helped me make the map that you're seeing on screen right now, the Köppen climate map of this planet. The planet is called TIRA 292b, at least for now. That's the astronomical designation. There might be some opportunities to come up with a sort of common name later, especially as the Neotets develop. Eventually, each of the Neotet cultures will probably have their own word for the world, but we'll get to that in due course. Right. So, what else can I tell you? The planet is, by and large, Earth-like. It's a little bit smaller than Earth. Has about 80% the gravity of Earth, but is, I mean, as you can tell from the climate map, it has roughly the same sort of. We're not talking about a gas giant or a super Earth or anything fancy like that. It's pretty typical. Slightly warmer average temperature than Earth, although the climate is in the middle of doing some fluctuations because there are some intermittent eruption events going on. But mostly, all of the same stuff from Earth is also applicable to the life on TIRA. And that includes, if we switch over to, can I put my slides up? There we go. So these are the Neotets, the sapient species. And oh yeah, I should say, since my background is in biology, I sort of reflexively default to using biologist terminology, which may or may not be appropriate or applicable in like social contexts. So forgive me if anything I say is not what am I trying to say? Just basically feel free to jump in and steer me in the right direction if things get too bogged down. But in any case, the Neotets are a fairly small species, about the size of the average dog, I guess. They are very social. They are largely sexually monomorphic. You can see the only real difference between the males and the females is that the females, on average, tend to be slightly larger and slightly stronger, but they are protandrous sequential hermaphrodites. So that means that whereas individuals that are born female, who are the minority, only about a quarter of the young are born as female, they will remain female for their entire lifespan. Whereas the males, which are about 75% of the young, a decent portion of them will become female as they age in accordance with various complex social factors. And they live, at least their ancestors, their ancestral condition is that they lived in these clans where kinship groups settled in. They evolved in this area where the distribution of resources is very patchy, and that consequently they developed a sort of weakly or facultatively eusocial system where breeding is monopolized by a small number of individuals at the top of the kind of social hierarchy. There are multiple species of neotect. So this one is Neotect onocumenes, which is the most, by the time of the modern period, is the most numerous and has spread across the largest portion of the planet. But there's at least one other species. I still haven't decided exactly how many other species are around at this point, but there's at least one other species, which is Neotecton gracilis. And there's no real meaningful difference. There's no between Neotect onocumenes and Neotecton gracilis. The only thing is that Neotecton gracilis evolved a little bit earlier on than Neotect onocumenes, and they spread northward a little bit earlier, and therefore they've had a little bit more time to adapt to the hotter climates that they find themselves in. So they've got slightly sparser fur, and they're a little bit smaller, and they have proportionally longer, more slender legs. But other than that, they're basically the same. So this is what the planet looks like in terms of topography and elevation. And so at this point, we're kind of assuming that the neotects, by the slice of time that we're looking at, have made it more or less across the whole planet. There might be some areas that they still haven't properly moved into, but for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that they exist kind of everywhere. And so I obviously can't go in and flesh out every single culture, because that would just be what do you call it? I swear there's a term for this, an infinite exercise, like something that you could just do forever and never get done with.
A Sisyphean task?
Yes, yeah, it would be a Sisyphean task indeed. So I think instead it's worth focusing on just a small handful of cultures that exemplify certain aspects of society and culture that I want to highlight. And particularly, I think the three that we're going to focus on today, and what will be the focus of the video that I'm working on at the moment, is these three zones. So in zone number one, we have the southwestern corner of the supercontinent, which, if we switch over to the biome view, we can see that it's relatively arid. There's some areas of rainfall along the coast here, but the further you move inland, the more you move into this desert area in the center. Can you see my cursor, by the way?
I cannot see your cursor.
Okay, well, that's fine. That just means I just have to be more descriptive.
And I do want to point out that it's the climate map's not a biome map.
Yes, this is true. If I do misspeak, please forgive me. I do know that there is a considerable difference, and that, in fact, that was something when I was less informed about the topic. That is something I had bemoaned previously. That it seemed to me, well, I won't get into that now, but I thought the terminology was confusing. I have since changed my ways. Anyway, so in this number one area, this is primarily where the Neotecton gracilis live, and I'm justifying that they stick around into the modern era because they are relatively isolated from the rest of the continent because of the mountain range that you can see just along the border of the number one region there. The kind of Neotect onocumenes has not yet managed to disperse into that area. I should also say, for what it's worth, I don't know how much any of this will actually be relevant for what we're doing, but the Neotects, as I'm conceiving of them at the moment, they, because they evolved in this landscape that kind of discouraged dispersal, that they lived around these very singular fixed territories. They historically have not been nearly as nomadic as early humans were. So they sort of spread across the world. It takes them a much longer time to do it relative to humans. And so the Neotectonic Humanes has not yet made it to this region of number one, which is part of the reason why Gracilis is still thriving relatively in that area. Then shall I talk about the cultures specifically, or what I've worked out for them at this point?
Perhaps we can jump into that after we discuss what a
Sure.
state and a polity is, and we
Sure.
answer some of
This is just
the questions. But I will also say that the desert to the north of Neotecton Gracilis, as well as the mountain range, would be something that would be pretty significant in
true.
discouraging migration, especially because, again, they tend to congregate around whatever resources that they're working with. So venturing out into a desert and then encountering a mountain range,
Yeah,
they may not really make it that far.
it's pretty off-putting.
Yeah.
Not very conducive to dispersal.
Though something to consider would be boats, because they may be a little bit closer by the coast. So if they figure that out at some point, that could be one of the main ways they encounter each other. If the folks in 3 go down just across the short strait there to that peninsula.
Yeah, that could be a point of contact, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So over in number 2, that area, switching over to the climate map. So area number 2 is much more mixed in terms of climate types. It's kind of close to, the continental interior will have fairly extreme temperature swings, but the closer you get to the ocean, the more that's kind of moderated. So it's still definitely a very seasonal area, but it's mild enough. As I say, there's going to be lots of sort of microclimates. There's this coastal range of hills. And I don't know how well you can see it on this map, but there's a big river here, which, as I'm thinking at the moment, is going to be the longest river in the world. There's this very big river basin here. Yeah, so I'm imagining that there could be some sedentism occurring there, just as the Neotechs exploit all of the various food sources available in that area. And number 3 is, again, don't know how well you can see, but there's a river, a fairly sizable river that empties through a sort of marshy delta into the sea. And around that point, I'm imagining a sort of coastal or various coastal societies emerging. And I do want to stress as well, when we talk about these areas, we're not talking about any one culture in particular. We're just talking about very broad strokes. The thinking that I've done at the moment is almost entirely limited to environmental factors, like how will they respond to the environments that they find themselves in. But of course, there's a lot more to culture than that, which is hopefully what we're going to be talking about today, is how they end up organizing themselves politically and socially. And I think that is basically everything I had to do by way of introduction. So let's set some groundwork, shall we? So what are we talking about in terms of what is a state and a polity, etc.? You are muted, I believe.
Oh, brilliant. It wouldn't be a video call if I wasn't muted at some point and tried to start talking. I have the Zoom meetings like every week, and it never fails not to happen. But yeah, what is a state? And when we're talking about state here, we're not talking about the state of, the experiential. We're talking specifically about political organization. That was very funny earlier, Jake. Um, Now, there is a decent amount of discussion as to what defines a state. And just because experts and scholars disagree and argue about it doesn't mean that the concept isn't useful or that it doesn't mean anything. It's far from it. Uh, but even though there isn't a specific definition that everyone agrees on, there are some common descriptive criteria for the concept of the state. Um, and most scholars agree on these following features that I have up on screen now. So we can describe a state as a hierarchical polity composed of centralized organizations that deploys violence to enforce legal order over a population within a given political autonomous territory, or a politically autonomous territory. And this is pretty dense, so I'm going to break it down. Yay. All right. So a polity. A polity is a unit of political organization. Polities include states, but they also include their subdivisions, like provinces and municipalities. Confusingly, for those of you who live in the United States, your federal government is the state, and your states are the province polities, essentially. But for many places in the world, currently and historically, kinship groups like clans and tribal federations were also very important polities. Um, you also had the various subdivisions, for example, in Athens. They had the different demis that they separated themselves into. They had 140 subdivisions, and then those were grouped into 30. So you can have different kinds of polities. That all kind of overlap and intersect with one another. But states, yeah, there we go. But states are hierarchical polities, where political participation and social position is stratified. And stratification describes the division of society into distinct groups or strata. These strata have a rank, and the rank is the position of power of these groups in relation to one another, and they're associated with different privileges. What hierarchies do, just as systems, because not all hierarchies are political, but hierarchies place elements in subordination or in domination to others, and that's what allows them to be ranked. To go back to Athens, for example, like Athens was a democracy. That's kind of where we get the term from. But only the strata of citizens, which consisted of a group of men, were able to participate in that democracy. Women, children, non-citizen residents, foreigners, and slaves could not participate. And they all had different ranks and corresponding privileges, or a lack of privileges, in relation to the citizens. Non-state peoples can also be stratified. Groups like this include those of the Pacific Northwest, like the Nuchahal or the Kwakwaka'wakw, who are stratified into elites, free band members, and slaves. And a majority of these slaves are kidnapped in raids from other communities. And if here we go, if Vancouver Island is my hand here, these groups tend to be on the western and northern side of the island. And for some of these groups, the winter village sites, almost 30% of those communities can be made up of slaves. And the elites relied on these slaves to produce a surplus of food, primarily salmon, for feasts. Further to the south of the island, the Coast Salish peoples also have stratification with elites, commoners, and slaves. However, unlike most societies with stratification, the number of people of each rank didn't resemble a pyramid. It more resembled an inverted pear, where a majority of the population were elites, a minority were commoners, and a small number were slaves or war captives, usually between 2 and 5%. So just because you have stratification in a polity doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to look like a pyramid. Classically, there are also egalitarian societies. Where are we? Did I miss one? No. Yeah, here we go. Classically, there are also egalitarian societies without stratification. Um, but even if a society doesn't have stratification with ranks and associated privileges, they may still have status. Unlike rank, status recognizes certain achievements, knowledge, or responsibilities. And like a big difference here is that leaders in stratified societies rely on coercion in order to uh, impose themselves on society. However, on the other hand, leaders in non stratified societies rely on forming consensus. You know, they don't have the means of violence in order to uh, impose anything upon people.
I do have a question about this at this point, if it's
Yeah, yeah.
appropriate to jump in. So, when we say that, what is it about them that defines them as a leader in that case? Because if they're not the ones who are actually forcing a decision to be upheld, and if the decision is arrived at by consensus,
Mhm.
then what sort of power do they actually hold?
Well, that is when we talk about power, we can have different ideas of
Hmm.
what power means. So, oftentimes when we talk about power, um, we're talking about like power over, right? Like domination. Power can also be power to, or your capacity to do something. And then another one is power with, right? And this is more where this notion of like consensus comes from. So, in certain non stratified societies, you can have positions of leader that um, are not necessarily inherited. So, for example, they may belong to a specific clan group or lineage, but anyone in that lineage could be the leader at that given point of time. And usually it's some subset of the community that decides who is the best fit to be that leader. Um, but what the leader does is essentially act as a facilitator. So they will talk to people, they'll, bring everyone together in a forum, they'll hear what everyone has to say about something, and they
Mm.
will lead that discussion, facilitate that discussion in order to form a consensus.
Oh,
Uh,
okay,
and in the way that these societies work is also radically different, right?
sure.
And I'm going to talk about this a bit more, but when you live in a non-state society, even if people in state societies may also experience this, especially if they live at a distance from the state and all the infrastructure and services that public governments usually provide. But you heavily rely on all the people in your social network. Uh, Everybody is necessary in order to make things work. So people are trying to maintain their social bonds and maintain the social fabric of society. Um, it's not like today where, if I'm not getting along with people at my job, I can quit and go find another job.
Mhm.
To some extent, people in non-state societies could leave whatever community they were in and go to another community where they had kinship relations or friends, or if they're a part of other polities, different networks, they can go to those communities. But the thing is that your reputation still follows you. Um, uh, so like there's the way that they function and the social logics are kind of fundamentally different, where if today you disagree with someone and they're like, well, you can't force me to do anything, the logic that there is the logic of the state, this logic of coercion. Like if you get in a disagreement with someone, it's like, well, you can't make me do it. In
Mm.
these societies, making someone do it is, if you're at a point where someone is so socially toxic that they refuse to engage, that is when some more serious punitive measures start to be enacted. And
Right.
in these societies, it's usually your own networks that enact those punitive measures. So, if you're being incredibly antisocial, if you're harming other people, if you're being greedy and hoarding food and being generally disagreeable, it's going to be your family and friends who are the ones who are going to be punishing you and setting you straight, because your negative behavior affects their ability, because of their social relation to you, to actually continue to exist in the community as a whole.
Sure.
So, where if in a non-state society you want to engage in a infrastructure project like building irrigation, the community would decide that irrigation is something they want to do, and then they would divide the labor within one of those polities or one of those networks. If, a hierarchical polity decides that it wants to do in infrastructure projects or collect taxes or something like that, they can deploy a certain amount of violence in order to impose that if people aren't just willing to do it for other kinds of coercion, like payment, for example. Yeah. Does that?
Yep.
That help?
I think that all makes sense to me.
Excellent. And folks in the chat can also drop comments, and whenever I finish a little section, we can return to those as well. So for the next point, states are centralized organizations. The bodies of political decision-making and administration, like assemblies, agencies, and courts, are all centralized and controlled by the state. As an example of this, we can distinguish between, say, the Roman Republic and the various Celtic groups that they were in confrontations with. The Gauls, for example, were not a unified polity. There wasn't a Gaulish state, or there weren't even any Gaulish states. They had a patchwork of overlapping polities linked by proximity and kinship and political relations. Romans and Gauls both lived in stratified societies, but assemblies of the Celts weren't centralized under a single polity or authority. Instead, there were many different magnates or elites, big men, if you will, who are more or less equivalent to one another and organize power through decentralized networks of patron and client relations, as well as their kinship relations. An anthropologist named Carol Crumley has, in the 80s and the 90s, has written about this, and she refers to this situation as a heterarchy, where there are multiple different centers of power that are unranked in relation to one another, or have the potential to be ranked in a number of ways. So if you have a bunch of different Celtic chiefs, and they're all deciding what they want to do, all of these chiefs have access to military power. They all have access to a follower base. They all have their own economic base. Sometimes these bases will overlap with one another. And they can't force one another to do anything unless they essentially go to war with one another. So instead, they have to come to some sort of conclusion through discussion and consensus. There can be some degree of coercion, like, people may support one another for a variety of reasons. But what's important here is that, many people are not necessarily involved in this decision making, though there are several Roman writings that do discuss how there were assemblies of certain Celtic groups who decided not to go to war with the Romans, and then the young military-aged men, the warriors, decided that they really wanted to go to war, so they kind of subverted the assemblies. And in that way, we can see, like, these assemblies did not have political control over the polities over which, they may have semi-governed. So there are also non-stratified societies where assemblies engage in decision-making in a more anarchistic or egalitarian way, where they don't utilize this kind of coercion, and they just voluntarily agree to group decision-making. while systems like these were practiced at a larger scale by indigenous groups like the Anishinaabe or the Haudenosaunee. And there's actually a really interesting enactment of this kind of political organization by the resistance committees in Sudan. For example, local practices among people around the world regularly engage in these kinds of assemblies. So, when people are living under a state or a stratified non-state society and they're living in smaller communities, oftentimes their assemblies and their councils are pretty egalitarian. I mean, there may be different status and social relations that can impact how these things go, but they aren't as explicitly hierarchical as some of the other organized bodies that we see under states. And McCain, German confederacies work like this too, probably. Yeah. All these kinds of confederacies where you have a group of elites, either by rank or status, who are the ones that are kind of making a lot of what we would probably consider to be like military and foreign policy decisions. Probably worked in that similar way. I'm going to jump on. Status is probably a far more important thing in non-state polities. Yes, status is incredibly important. And something that really differentiates status is that status is not something that's inherited, right? Necessarily. So status can be achieved. So status can be recognized because, if someone is good at what they do, then they're probably someone who you want to take point on doing certain things. If someone has a lot of knowledge about a particular subject, then they're the one who, you probably want to guide everyone else in doing that. And so when certain societies select leaders, regardless of what we call them, when they call them chiefs or something else like that in a non-state society, usually they're trying to pick someone who has what they feel is the proper temperament and disposition, as well as the knowledge is necessary, because they also tend to have multiple different kinds of leaders. So the status is also there are lots of different statuses, and those statuses tend to decentralize potential power throughout the society. And none of these leaders tend to have any kind of authority over one another. They're just kind of all operating in the same non-stratified way. There's also the older Greek model. Oh, I can bring that up, can't I? Can I bring that up? Yes, I can. There's also the older Greek model, other to this too, of having a war leader and a civil leader. Yes, that is exceptionally common, of having a war leader and a civil leader, and these are distinct from one another. And that's a very important separation of power that we tend to see in state and non-state societies, both stratified and non-stratified.
And so these leaders would be on an equal playing field in terms of, like, one wouldn't be like under the
Right.
There wouldn't be a hierarchical structure where one is beneath the other.
No. One takes priority in certain situations.
Sure.
And war leaders could be, and like war leaders are usually gain their role through achievement as well. Like, you do certain things in war in order to be recognized as a war leader. And this is also like, and of course, in a lot of non-state societies, people are also trying to gain status, right? Because gaining status has benefits. I mean, you don't necessarily get more wealth than anybody else in these societies, but you do have a certain amount of prestige and legitimacy, and people listen to you, and your word carries more weight when people recognize that you have status. So, in a decent amount of non-state societies, even if they're non-stratified, there is a tendency to, want to go to war occasionally, because that is a chance for people in attempt to gain status and protect, potentially become a war leader, or become more politically important. But yeah, so, and there are also like a variety of different networks and institutions and organizations. So you may have, and so your civil group, like your kinship group, may also be the people who you go to war with, but you may also have distinct warrior societies or warrior organizations that draw people from different kinship groups. And your kinship group may be your peacetime political group, but the war society is the wartime political group. And because you belong to both of these groups and they both have their own status and leadership and those sorts of things, there's also a lot of encouragement to kind of follow these distinct systems. We can talk about inheritance in a bit. Kairos, yeah. All right, I'm going to move on. Speaking of violence, I believe, are we going to talk about violence, or are we talk about which one's next? Yes. Okay. Oh yeah, that's the heterarchies and anarchies. Yeah, so just to go over it again, because I think this is an important distinction that I'll continue to make. Heterarchies are stratified societies with multiple centers of power, and these centers of power are not ranked in relation to one another, so they're more or less equal, or they have the potential to be ranked in different ways. And then anarchies or egalitarian societies have decentralized governance and lack stratification. Notably here, we're using anarchies in the sense of no rulers. I know colloquially it's commonly used to mean chaos or disorder. In political science, sometimes in international relations, anarchy is used to define certain international orders where there's no hegemonic power kind of establishing an order through violence or coercion. And sometimes political scientists also use the term anarchy to describe failed states or weak states where there are a lot of non-state violent actors. But as anarchism in this sense is referring to, in a broad way, societies that have decentralized governance and lack stratification. They can look wildly different from one another. Oh. Madeline, you've been fed and watered. Wonderful.
Very good.
Ooh, excellent. So an important quality of the state is the ability to enforce a centralized order on the population within its territory. So rather than the population electing to follow a polity's order of their own accord, because as I mentioned before, state political participation is inherently exclusive, it has to be enforced to some degree. This is often referred to as the state having the monopoly of violence. Now, this doesn't mean that the state is the only entity committing violence within its territory. Max Weber, who is a sociologist who's very important in the theorization of the state, emphasizes that the monopoly of violence refers to the legitimate enforcement of state rules and not a control of all violence. This is one of the reasons why vigilanteism is something that's looked down on in many states. The state as a centralized body wants to be the one to enforce its own rules. It doesn't want random citizens to be doing that, because that threatens the state's monopoly of enforcement. Of course, that also means that the state gets to pick and choose when its rules apply. But it also means that non-state actors like criminal organizations can exist within a state. And a state can still be considered to have the monopoly of violence. Um, and as a counterexample, there are customary practices, and I'm going to talk about the Pacific Northwest because that's one of my research areas. Customary practices among indigenous groups in the Pacific Northwest, where if a person harms another in their community, there is no central authority that decides on a punishment. Or what happens is that their kin group that they belong to negotiates the compensation or the punishment. If you harm someone from another kin group, the two kin groups negotiate with one another. If you harm someone from another community, then those two communities will negotiate with one another. And this negotiation is very important because there is no central means of coercion. And all of these groups, all of these different polities have an interest in negotiating what is seen as a fair compensation or punishment, because they have to continue to exist and work together alongside one another in order for their culture and their society to continue existing. Which, can be something that is a bit different. Boom. As I understand it, the monopoly of violence is a rather modern invention. Medieval, quote-unquote, states were never able to do that. Yes, and we're going to be talking about how I would not describe medieval kingdoms and such, most of them as states. But we do have many, medieval and ancient societies that did form states, and they did have a monopoly of violence. The monopoly of violence in contemporary states, especially in the beginning of the late modern period, is much more expansive than older states, but it is still something that older states did. It was something that they were very concerned with. When we think about state formation, it's in the constant process of happening. The state doesn't emerge and then it's done. The state emerges and then it continues to try to hierarchicalize all of the relations under it. It tries to mediate all of the relations of its within its territory, and it tries to make all of the relationships and institutions legible in order for them to be regulated. But there were medieval societies that were states and were able to have a monopoly of violence and centralized governance. Many medieval societies and kingdoms in Western, Central, Eastern Europe weren't able to do this. They just didn't have the capacity to. Boom. All right, and then we talked about... All right, and then the final bit here... Oh, yeah, and I think this is a response to one of your questions that you had, which is, there may be some notion that non-state societies, and particularly more egalitarian societies, don't have, punishments or responses to people breaking the peace or tearing at the social fabric of society. But all societies have some form of normative order. And what I mean by a normative order is a way that one ought to behave or act. And when you break that to significant degrees, the society is going to respond to it. States use coercion and violence to impose these top-down orders, and they also kind of control the response. If you're having a dispute with your neighbor and you decide to impose some sort of punishment upon your neighbor, the state could see that as illegal. Like they would say, no, you don't get to do that. The state has to do that. You have to go through the police and bylaw and those sorts of things. But in that case, the state also gets to decide when a interaction rises to the level of crime that they decide that it's time for them to intervene in a way.
Mm.
While in non-state polities, they rely on a lot of decentralized networks and institutions for de-escalation and for dispute resolution and for decision-making about these kinds of things. And it usually involves the kinship groups and the various networks of the people who are engaged with one another. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's kind of constant and ongoing social de-escalation for various conflicts. It's not something where it has to rise to a certain level before everybody else steps in. It's people start noticing things and they immediately start to respond to it. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And McCain's saying it's more like a regulatory ideal than ever really even in modern times. Yeah, so there are a couple issues today with contemporary states. We even talk about them having a monopoly of violence, but states have limitations. Even contemporary states have limitations in their capacity and their capabilities. If there's so many breaches of state law happening, there are only so many resources in people, in labor hours, in material and supplies that the state has in order to address all of these things. So there's always going to be these limitations. Of course, states have become more sophisticated, both in their legal apparatus as well as the technologies that they deploy in order to impose a monopoly of violence. But it is still something that, dynasties in China, the Roman Empire, the Byzantines, the Mongols famously with like Pax Mongolica, right? Like they had a monopoly of violence. They had things that they enforced and that they protected. And they took it very seriously. States also in the past protected their borders as well, which brings us to the final component of our definition of a state here, which is that a state is a politically autonomous territory. So the first part of this is that the state governs a population within a defined space, right? There are borders and there's a space within which the state governs. So that's the one point. And historical states were also very interested in this. Even in antiquity, in the Bronze Age, state polities would establish border forts in order to control who was coming in and going out, and to make sure that they could extend their control to the edges of their territory. Whether or not they were capable of constantly enforcing it within every inch of their territory is,
sure,
not something that could have happened. It doesn't happen now, as I mentioned, but that is something that they endeavored to do. We can also think of the very complicated system of like Roman border forts that they established, at the edges of empire. Second, the state is autonomous and not subordinate to another state or another polity. So, for example, New York State in the United States, it is subordinate to the federal government. So New York State is a polity, but because it's not autonomous, it isn't a state. We also have various situations where empires, would conquer other states and then subordinate them in one form or another. So these would become vassal polities rather than a state as such.
So just to confirm that I'm actually thinking about this in the right way, it is not possible, therefore, when we're talking about heterarchies, there is no such thing as a heterarchy that is composed of states, because by definition a state would have to be politically autonomous.
Right. Yeah. So what you could think of instead is a kind of like, you could think of it as more of a confederation, right? Something where you have distinct states who then have a interstate institution or organization to coordinate action. But once that body becomes a central authority that then organizes itself in a dominant position over the composite states, that would then be the state.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, we have Lavia here. There's an element in democratic states about legitimizing state violence through democratic participation, providing democratic means of deciding rules and legitimize the enforcement of them. Yeah, and we often see this, going back to Athens as well, people got to vote on who they got to banish and exile. And the courts in Athens also involved citizens participating in voting on the outcomes. It also involved citizens being the magistrates, for example. And some of these positions were also determined by lot. So people would randomly become a judge, for example. So there are a lot of ways to kind of legitimize state violence by incorporating the citizen population. Another important thing to mention about Athens, though, is that a lot of their state bureaucracy was able to function through state slaves, publicly owned slaves who were literate and who were the ones who actually did all of the things. So your citizen may not necessarily be literate, and they may not necessarily know how to, be a court official, but that was what their public slaves were for holding that knowledge. This conceptual definition is a bit strange. It means that most of the world didn't have states, and that some modern UN members are not really states. Yeah, most of the world did not have states until quite recently, until the last few hundred years. To be fair, this can be quite ambiguous. Like the Holy Roman Empire, there were formal subordination to the King of Germany, sometimes the Holy Emperor, but the de facto control varied quite a lot. Yes, I mean, the Holy Roman Empire wasn't itself a state. It was composed of all of these autonomous and semi-autonomous territories, which themselves weren't necessarily states. And the role that the HRE played in some of the larger polities that composed it, like Bohemia, for example, is also something that we can be discussed. But the important part of these kinds of definitions of the state, and people change, different scholars use different definitions of the state to explore different things and make different arguments. So it's the point of this definition is to one, introduce a lot of the common elements that scholars, both scholars of ancient states and scholars of modern states, use to discuss them, and to see how that kind of comes up against common ideas of what a state or a country or a nation is. And subordinate seems like it could be very difficult to determine, especially when the relationship isn't unilateral. Yes, and that is why concepts like hierarchy are important. Because if you don't have sort of these institutionalized, centralized relationships, you tend to get a lot more. You tend to get a lot more messy situations that don't necessarily fit within the bucket of a state. So just to return to this conception of a state that we've been developing, the state is a hierarchical and centrally organized polity that governs a population within an autonomous territory. And as I mentioned before, there are different ways that states can conceive of their territory. They have different capacities and capabilities. They also develop different ruling ideologies and technologies within their environments to enact, their different forms of control. and they're always in a process of change. They're trying to centralize, they're trying to hierarchicalize, they're trying to control their territory and the people within it as best they can, but it's not a straight line. Sometimes it moves back, sometimes it moves forward. People can clamor for less state control in certain things, or different strata of society can become involved in the state over time or be excluded. So it's never sort of a straight arrow in this development. And with that, we have Bib's second question here. Are states inevitable? So states are not an inevitable political formation. And as Zipporah mentioned before, as Zipporah kind of pointed out before, many places around the world were stateless or non-state societies until the late modern period, which traditionally starts at the beginning of the 19th century. States did emerge in certain regions across the globe, but many societies continue to practice non-state forms, or they abandoned the state and developed other ways of living. The idea that states are an inevitable formation comes from this kind of 19th century theory of cultural evolution, which divided societies or cultures into a successive series of stages, from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states. This exact formation that we see here of this model comes from service, and it was developed in the 1960s and 70s as kind of a neo-evolutionist model. But cultural evolution portrayed humans as progressively advancing from so-called primitive savagery through pastoral barbarism to agricultural civilization. And this, within the concept of the social sciences, as we've developed our understanding of how different cultures emerge and move through different formations, doesn't hold up anymore. And substituting a metaphor here from biology, right? It would be like saying all creatures must develop trichromatic vision at some point, and those with trichromatic vision are the most advanced, and those without trichromancy are just on their way to having trichromatic vision, which that is not the case.
It reminds me a lot of the typical March of Progress thing, of the depiction of the primate becoming more and more human and presenting it in a sort of linear fashion of advancement, which is teleological inherently.
Yes, and that is one of the problems with this model of band, tribe, chiefdom, state. The first being is that it's unilineal, which means it's this set sequence of stages that all cultures are supposed to go through. But we know that's not really the case. A lot of chiefdoms never become states, and it seems like a lot of states did not come from chiefdoms. For example, preceding Uruk, which is a city-state that was in Mesopotamia, we have the Ubaid villages, and those villages don't have any evidence of chiefly leadership or wealth distribution, right? They look like more or less egalitarian villages. So, they didn't go from chiefdom to state. They had a different form of development. The next is that it is universal. And evolutionists would argued that societies in a particular stage are identical to all others in that stage. And because of the unilinear model here, that means that cultural evolutionism assumes that any hunter-gatherer society is identical and representative of past hunter-gatherer societies, including those of the Neolithic. But modern hunter-gatherer groups are just as contemporary and have changed just as much as other societies have. And there are hunter-gatherer groups that also came from state societies. They were parts of states, and then they abandoned states and they became hunter-gatherers. So the idea that they would be identical, um, would be false. I mean, there are some things that we can extrapolate because their subsistence is the same. They may live in a similar environment to past hunter-gatherers, but they're not fungible. A big important point of this is that this model emerged out of prejudicial and unfounded ideas about progressivism that framed European agricultural state societies as civilized and enlightened, while non-European, non-agricultural, and non-state societies were some form of, as I mentioned before, primitive savagery or barbarism. Cultural evolutionism begged the question in the rhetorical term, the actual term, by baking assumptions about the change of human society over time into their theory. They assumed off the bat that certain people were more civilized than others, and then they tried to make a model to justify it.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, as you mentioned, this is very teleological. Cultural evolutionism argues that the function of human societies is to become more civilized, whatever that means, over time. But as I said, they really lacked evidence to back up any of these ideas, and they have been discarded by the field, though we do see it outside academia, and sometimes there are scholars from outside the field who kind of pick up these ideas and run with them. But there are neo-evolutionist ideas have continued to develop to such a degree that what they're looking at now isn't this kind of teleological model of evolution. Neo-evolutionists now are more interested in what kind of structures are necessary in order for certain changes to happen, or what kind of changes in a society facilitate or encourage societies to evolve or change into different societies. So they're taking a much more I think they're kind of learning a bit more from the concept of evolution, and it's like societies are
Sure.
not moving in a specific direction. The next question we had here is it conceivable that a world could exist without states? And
this was kind of a dumb question in retrospect.
I don't think it is, though, because I think it's something that a lot of people would think of asking. But I would say sure. States are a quite recent innovation. Homo sapiens have been around for a few 100,000 years. And states only really start showing up in the 3rd millennium BCE. And even after agriculture and domesticating animals and things, it took about 9,000 years for states to emerge, excluding the dog. The dog is much older, of course. And then, many places have flirted with states or state-like structures, but ultimately abandoned them as well until the state form was imposed upon them in the last few hundred years, usually, through imperialism or colonization. And sometimes, states dissolve or are torn apart by conflict, and they leave weak states behind or non-state polities in their wake. And a big example of this is the fractured landscape of kingdoms and principalities in medieval Europe after the dissolution of the Roman Empire and its successor states, because some of the various kingdoms that the Romans left behind were able to continue to have centralized governments, even if they were weaker for a period. These polities in medieval Europe were stratified, and power was concentrated in the hands of a few in privileged ranks of the aristocracy, but control was quite fragmented. And what's important is kings didn't govern much beyond their own domain, and kingdoms were better understood as composite or amalgamated polities, where the different parts expressed significant autonomy and self-governance. So, what Zipporah mentioned here, political power could make some minor landholding families be called estates, in medieval history tend to at least add continuity and non-personal relations. And a lot of definitions of the states, this kind of personal relationships and charisma, instead of having centralized institutions, is something that is more non-state. And I mean, I was a medievalist prior to being a geographer. So kind of trying to fit the understanding of the medieval polity within this broader framework of states. Though there are medieval scholars who refer to the feudal state or a medieval state. We don't tend to want to use the term feudal for a variety of reasons. But when we look at, and it's also something to compare, like, when you look at the kind of very decentralized and autonomous polities of medieval Europe, you can compare them to contemporary polities in medieval Europe that are much more centralized. So you do have this spectrum of polities where some are states or state-like and others are not. And McCain here, yeah, feudal went out of fashion, but an economic global historian actually don't mind it. Yeah, I mean, people still use it, and I think someone mentioned, like Marxian history, like, Marxians tend to use it, but they also tend to use it in like a very narrow economic way, instead of talking about vassalage and these kinds of things. If people want to use it and define it, that's fine, but otherwise, what do we have on the next one here? Yes. But for a lot of medieval kingdoms, there was a lack of sovereignty, centralized governance, and territoriality. Instead, a lot of political relationships weren't maintained with central organizations or institutions. Instead, there were personal relationships among elites that maintained political formations. Beginning in the 14th century, polities began to centralize power and to come up with different ruling ideologies that sharpened borders towards, this idea of a state that we kind of tend to see today. So that by the 16th century, in the early modern period, we start seeing sovereign states again in the European peninsula. Weak states did pop up. The early Carolingian Empire could be seen as a weak state before infighting kind of ripped it apart. But it really is the early modern period in Europe that we start to see authorities consolidate polities into states. And there are a lot of popular fantasy settings that are already non-state societies. We can think about the Seven Kingdoms and the Song of Ice and Fire. My criticisms of Martin's depictions of nomadic and pastoral people, among other things. But the Seven Kingdoms are a decent example of like a hierarchical medieval polity, where you have at the beginning of the books like Robert Baratheon. He's a central authority and he's Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, but he has very little effective control over the other kingdoms and little governing capacity beyond King's Landing or his own realm in the Stormlands. The relationships between and within these kingdoms are personal, and they're organized through marriage and inherited obligations and agreements, and not centralized in state organizations or institutions. Each kingdom has a great deal of autonomy. They have their own militaries, their own treasuries and such. So rather than a hierarchical state, Westeros is more of a complex hierarchical polity. Instead of like a top-down pyramid among these kingdoms, they're a hierarchical system where it's more of a web, and certain people may be more close to the center of this web, but they're more or less comparable. So even without states, that's not to say that coercive, stratified, centralized, or territorial polities couldn't and didn't emerge. But a state, is a very specific kind of polity. And humans have existed in a variety of polities, often multiple polities simultaneously. And the state is just one way of doing things. Whether or not a large worldwide society like what we have in our own world could develop without a state is an interesting question. There are some sites in the archaeological record in various documented societies that had a lot of complexity without states. And there are examples of non-state polities emerging in the modern world, though these polities also tend to be confronted by states around them for a variety of reasons. But there's a lot of room for world builders to speculate on alternative presents and futures. I think so wait a minute. Did I miss a question? I can't see my little titles because the live thing is blocking it. Is that what's possible? How many times have they emerged? All right, we're just going to jump to how many times have states emerged. So social scientists refer to the first states to emerge in a region as like archaic states, primary states, or pristine states. I personally don't like the pristine term. And at one point it was meant that, they kind of innovated this idea of the state like in a vacuum, but we really don't necessarily know how the idea of the state necessarily arrived in some of these places. And as I mentioned in a bit, states emerge in complexes. There are often microstate cultures. So a state isn't emerging alone. It's often emerging in network with other polities that are also forming states. With that being said, state formation has happened at least a half a dozen times, and there's probably going to be more that we discover as we use LiDAR and we discover more sites. I mean, there were some sites that have been discovered in the Amazonian basin that show a good degree of complexity, which could have a state society. So that would be another one for South America that could be interesting. But the often agreed upon, there's consensus for primary state development includes the Nile River Valley, Mesopotamia, South Asia. And the South Asia is a bit of a question. There's a debate as to whether the Indus Valley civilization was composed of city-states or if it was a different kind of formation. So it was either the Indus Valley or the Ganges River Valley where states emerged in South Asia. There's also the Andes in South America, Mesoamerica, the Western Sahel, the Yellow or Yangtze River Basin in what's now northern China, and then the Tonga Islands in Polynesia. There are several other candidates that are debated. So, for example, the Hawaiian Islands can be seen as undergoing a process of state formation, consolidating through war all of the various polities on the islands. But those are, in debate as people, hone in on different ideas of the state and have these arguments. I'm hopeful that Amazonian archaeology will reveal some more about the prehistory of the region. Yeah, I'm really excited for that. I think there's lots that we can learn about, early societies and the way that they humanized the landscape and built all sorts of really fascinating infrastructures in the Amazon basin. And it'd also be quite interesting to see what we can learn about the changes that happened between this very dense societies and the variety of forager societies that we see emerge within a very short period of time. Trying to avoid the Wil building live stream about statehood becoming a medievalist hangout and spot. Yes. Hey, I think medievalists are quite cool, having been a medievalist. All right.
Okay.
So this one's on the prerequisites for the development of the state. And so this is something that I mentioned before, is that non-state societies, you have a lot of these autonomous and semi-autonomous polities and organizations and institutions and networks that function alongside each other in order for society to work. Every person, every household, the household unit was usually the unit of, I guess, the smallest social unit, were entangled in a bunch of different groups. You had your kin relations, you had local groups, regional groups, clubs, ritual societies, extended kin groups. And these networks were necessary to make all of these vital decisions and distribute goods and de-escalate conflict. And the transition from a non-state society to a state occurs when you have a central authority that starts to legitimize the actions and decisions and disputes between these formerly autonomous groups. It simplifies the differences and starts to make all of these different organizations that interact more legible and easier to govern by absorbing their functions. This is a goal, though, and it's not a straightforward process. And for primary states, this formation occurs at a very small scale, which is why a lot of states actually tend to be microstates, often city-states or very small territorial areas that form from different local communities coming together. So, one example of this is that, perhaps one kin group or a local group subordinates the others through diplomacy and conquest or trade, right? Maybe an assembly from a bunch of local villages elects some military leaders, and some of those military leaders are popular and competent enough for several generations in order to create a dynasty and start centralizing control. There are a lot of different ways that state formation could have happened. And as I mentioned, states frequently emerge in systems of peers that create a shared culture. And we can think about the city-state cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, like in the Aegean or in Mesopotamia. We can also think about the Mayan city-state cultures in Mesoamerica. We see similar things happening in the Andes, in North China, as well as in South Asia. Sometimes these city-states are quite close to each other, measured in tens of kilometers away. And sometimes they can be quite far. So in the case of the Harappan or Indus Valley culture, if they are city-states, they tend to be like hundreds of kilometers away from each other, which is very interesting. And it's one of the reasons why some people argue that they're not city-states. They are cities, but they're not states. And these city-state cultures tend to share same language. They tend to also have similar models of governance. So while, in the Aegean, if we look at the ancient Greek world, you've got tyrannies and oligarchies and democracies and monarchies. They do tend to converge around a similar model for governance with their constitutions and citizenship and councils, both large and small councils, though sometimes they don't have one of the two, as well as magistrates and public slaves to kind of run things. Usually, primary states have sedentary agriculture or a mix of sedentary agriculture and horticulture, and they also control their populations. Though urbanism isn't necessary, it's very common in patterns of primary state formation. And this is all to keep in mind that there are non-state societies that has sedentary agriculture and relatively dense populations that never formed states until they were imposed upon them by other people. States also notably empty out the surrounding landscape around the kind of center that they form, and they relocate populations to kind of centralize economic production, whether it's in a city or a palace. but there's usually not a pressure of overpopulation. States can continue to expand into the hinterland. There are some examples where states did state formation where there was some like overpopulation. I think that's the Tongan case. There's a lot more variation for secondary state formation, especially when these secondary states that form are appropriating pre-existing state apparatus. So the Mongol Empire, for example, was quite different than the microstates of the ancient world, but they were still a state, even though they weren't very stable and they didn't last very long when compared to their successor states, especially those in the periphery of the steppe, like the Yuan dynasty, for example. Something that the Mongols did was they literally just appropriated state administration and bureaucracy and people from the places they went in order to kind of construct their state apparatus. So that the building blocks of a state were already around, and they just kind of scooped it all up. So what are cities? Since we talked about city-states, and cities seem to be very important in primary state formation, much like the definition of the state, social scientists have different ideas about what a city is. There are certain characteristics that we can agree upon. In this case, cities are permanent settlements with large populations that are socially diverse economic centers for production, distribution, and long-distance trade, with complex economic relationships between competing and cooperating groups who share a civic identity, which augments or adds to their own identities. Importantly, cities change the way of life for those who live in them, as well as those who live in the surrounding rural areas. And this is because they are centers, so they reorient people's relations towards the city. There's some features of definitions of cities that have been tossed out. The idea that cities must have monumental architecture like palaces, or they must have fortifications like perimeter walls. There are a lot of cities that don't have what we would see as monumental architecture, and there are a bunch of them that don't have fortifications. And this isn't because they didn't have war or anything like that. They could very well have had war, but fortifications tend to emerge only in situations where militaries had the capacity to actually do a siege. And there are a lot of state societies and non-state societies that did not have that capacity. Do I have another one? Yeah, okay. So the concept of a city is also often associated with stratification or particular political formations like the state, though we do see non-stratified states that look like cities and city-state cultures that emerged from cities rather than the other way around. So you had cities first and then states, rather than states first, then cities. There were certainly cities like in Mesopotamia, where there were kings and hereditary elites. They had a centralized state religion with hierarchical administrations. And at the same time, there's also other forms of governments that were employed, like councils or assemblies. And while cities in the popular imagination that had direct governance, like Athens, for example, they still had stratification with a large slave underclass, including the public slaves. But other cities, like in the Indus Valley, like the Harappan cities, as well as city cultures in West Africa, kind of challenge our understanding of urbanism. So in the Indus Valley, these sites resemble Mesopotamian cities with their elaborate infrastructure and dense residential architecture, which indicates really sophisticated coordination for construction and maintenance. But there's a lack of evidence of elite burials, kingship, state palaces, or temples. So a lot of contemporary scholars suggest different political dynamics with power distributed among different groups in a hierarchical or egalitarian formation. Something important to note, though, is that where we may not see a specific palace complex or something like that in Indus Valley sites, We don't see that either in the Ganges Valley's sites. What we see instead is a walled inner compound where we have elite residences. So just because we don't see a palace doesn't necessarily mean there weren't elites. And therefore, it doesn't kind of rule out that there was a state, because, social scientists just may not be as perceptive or inventive enough to kind of get into the mindset of the Indus Valley people, and understand the purpose of the different architecture at the site. But my current money is on them being a more heterarchical formation. We also have Jene Jeno. This is a site in the Niger Valley, which was occupied and kind of reached its height between the 3rd century BCE and the 9th century CE, which had loosely connected urban clusters surrounded by a shared perimeter wall. Though the wall was built quite late. I think the wall would have been built around the 7th or 8th century CE. Each of these clusters had their own corporate groups that had specialized manufacturing and residential areas, but there are no elite residences, monuments, or palaces, and there are a variety of different burial practices throughout the clusters. So each cluster seems to be its own, subcultural group, which is very interesting. And from looking at the material evidence, groups coordinated reciprocal relations between different clusters without a central authority or any kind of hierarchy, in a more egalitarian way. There's also a greater Jene Jeno urban complex, so this site isn't unique. It's part of a tradition of sub-Saharan pre-urban and urban sites that span back to, 4500 BCE. So ancient cities didn't need kings or hereditary elites, centralized state religions, or administrative hierarchies. But as cities grow in complexity, they do need some form of administration and institutions for coordinating themselves. So information technologies and coordination, like organizational technologies, tend to develop hand in hand with efforts to kind of structure urban and rural landscapes. And as I mentioned with states, the development of cities is not a straight line. Some groups form large permanent settlements to coordinate action and redistribute their labor among different groups in an egalitarian way, without any material evidence of wealth equality, only to abandon these attempts and return to smaller communities. Other cities were formed and existed, and then we have evidence that they collapsed in civil strife or in revolution or in some sort of violence, and then people abandoned the site and went back to a more rural or pastoral way of living. So cities are not also this kind of unilineal teleological development for civilizations. And that, whereas I think covers all of the questions that you had, Bib, about polities and state development in cities.
Yes, thank you. So that's all of my big questions, because going into this, I had very little understanding of the topic at all. But that is a very good overview of how to conceptualize these things. So now the task, we don't have a huge amount of time left, but we can do a quick overview of, if we get my map back up. So I guess I'll just do a very quick overview of what I have worked out for these areas, just in terms of the sort of setup. So in Area 1, as I say, largely inhabited by Neotecton gracilis. And because the resources in this area are relatively transient, I am imagining that there will be a fairly large number of nomadic groups. Again, we're not focusing on any one individual culture at this point, or at least I haven't gone down to that level yet. Particularly, I'm imagining that along that mountain range that you can see on the eastern side, There will be some orographic rains, so seasonal rains that occur primarily during the summer that will encourage some groups to move into the highlands
Mhm.
um, and set up seasonal encampments, etc. And by the
Mhm.
way, I should mention that all of this, we're still conceiving of this as being very early on in neotech's history. This is before any domestication.
Mhm.
So, as much as I would love to talk about pastoralism and the development of agriculture at this point, that's still a ways off. Um, then area number two, I'm conceiving of as being largely sedentary,
Mhm.
or being home to a number of sedentary cultures, because this area is varied enough um, in terms of climate and available food sources that there are enough sustenance options for cultures to sustain themselves throughout the whole year. So there's no real need to move to new areas.
Mhm.
And then number three is, as I say, they live in this sort of swampy, marshy delta.
Yeah.
Um, and so they largely rely on the resources that they can get from the sea, so mariculture and aquaculture. They have technologies like fishing weirs and canals, things of that nature. So, kind of similar to things like the Calusa in Florida or
Mhm.
the Pacific Northwest. The majority of their caloric uptake is going to be from aquatic sources.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, how can we apply everything we've talked about, re the development of states to these? And again, it's very important to me that I don't want to present this in any way like a teleological thing of saying that these
Yeah.
early cultures, they start to form states and then they start to form agriculture and then they progress. Like, we absolutely don't need to say that all three of these are states. None of them could be states. Just if it would make sense for any of them to progress to, again, I use the dirty word progress.
Progress.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, not what I mean. But if statehood would be a thing that would make sense for any of these three, then yeah, you can think about how that might work.
So the emergence of states for all of these groups could potentially make sense because there are, certain climatic conditions and ways that they would organize themselves that did lend itself to the development of states in certain places. So, for example, you're talking about how in this period of time, the neotechs in number three rely largely on mariculture and aquaculture. They're building canals and they're doing a lot of fishing and building weirs and fish traps and these sorts of things. They can go, and at this point, they're very similar to the Calusa. Um, they could also rely on a variety of horticulture. The groups of the Pacific Northwest did rely, especially the groups like the Kwakwakwak and Nuchahol and Tlingit, relied on uh, fishing a lot and like hunting whales and other things like that. They also used a variety of gardens. These gardens were more prominent in the south, where it was a bit warmer, but they
Mhm.
also used them in the north. So they had like root vegetable gardens, they had estuarine or estuary gardens. They also built like clam gardens, which
Mhm.
is a very cool. They would like roll rocks into certain places to actually expand the beach and fill it with light sediment that different clam species liked, and they tend
Yeah.
the development of them, which I think is very cool. Um, so we could see from this period where they're much more like the Calusa, they kind of develop certain kinds of horticulture and gardening. But in places that were swampy wetlands, we do see people transitioning from um, forms of horticulture and uh, managing certain plant species to emptying out the wetlands, uh, using seasonal floods and canals to then move more towards an agricultural society.
Mm.
Um, but with that being said, a lot of wetland places also that were around state development tended to be non-state and non-agricultural for longer, just because it's a real pain in the butt for states to actually control people in the wetlands because it's muddy and it sucks to walk through, and it's difficult to control the people who live in there. So when we do see states that develop along rivers with like these kind of wetland deltas, we tend to see the states develop further upriver and then eventually make their way to the kind of delta area.
Okay.
And that's something that we saw in the Nile River Valley and as well as Mesopotamia. But I mean, again, but if we're looking at the Calusa and the people of the Pacific Northwest didn't move towards state societies. They continued to have non-state polities, even though they were both quite stratified. And the Calusa themselves spent a lot of time vassalizing and establishing relations of subordination with other groups around them. So there's still a lot of interesting opportunities for complex political dynamics to develop, even if you decide on a non-state. I think like in a sort of lithic stage, like right now, there would probably all be different non-state polities. But what you'd want to do is figure out what the salient kinds of polities are that they do have. So the clan groups is a big one, right?
Yeah.
Like they each have their own fortified compounds. But as they start becoming more social and start interacting with other compounds, more of these different networks would emerge. So you'd want to think. I don't think you mentioned it in your last video, but when we have the kind of mating pairs, we don't have very good language for this at this point.
Yeah,
but,
this is what I mean when I say I kind of default
yeah.
to the biologist terminology that sounds kind of weird when it's applied in an anthropological context.
Yeah, but when you have a female neotech who's elevated to being the position of mother, I suppose, that neotech would take a husband. We assume, right? I believe you mentioned that they're monogamous, right?
Yes, largely monogamous. Although I imagine in some societies there might be some degree of polyandry. A mother could perhaps take multiple husbands, possibly reflective of status. Yeah, lots of possibilities.
So there would be. So then the choice of husbands, like they probably come from a different clan and probably an unrelated clan, preferably not one that has the same sort of matrilineal connection. We also have the possibility for the development of broader clan groups where, yes, you have one clan, but then there could be another fortified compound that was established by see the females, like that is not don't like referring to people as females. That is a bad thing. Don't do that. That's not cool. Just for the audience out there. When we can say independent women, I guess, who aren't really in that queuing order to become a mother to the clan, a clan mother. That's a great term. Okay, they can go establish their own clan, right? And they can take some relatives or some other people from their group with them. So then instead of having one clan, you now have a clan and then a cadet branch, or like a broader group. And yes, we're also not saying femoids. The girly pops, that is very good. So then we could have like relationships of clans. And what can be interesting is in some cases these if the clan is established from one matriline, then you have this landscape where you could have multiple different compounds, and they are composed of matrilines that originate in different clans. So the compounds could become distinct or be composed of multiple clans. And these clan groups could then support each other across compounds, and you could have this development of trade between them. There's a question as to whether these various compounds would be um, uh, subordinate to one another. So, maybe a clan wants to establish maybe one of the outposts of the clan, around the border of their territory, starts to become a secondary compound site. And there's some people who move there, in which case you could have the primary compound as the main settlement, and then the secondary compound as subordinate to it. But then you could also have a situation where, when the independent neotech goes out to establish and become establish a new matriline and become a new clan mother, they could just be like equivalents. And we see this with the colonization of like Greek city states, essentially, where the citizens are just like, no, we're gonna make our own polis over here somewhere, and we're gonna be independent. But sometimes these colonization attempts by Greek polises were also like subordinate as well. So like you can have an interesting landscape. And when you start getting these polities in a closer proximity, you have the opportunity for this kind of clustering to start to happen. So, you could start to have like pre-urbanism or early kinds of urbanism start to form.
That's kind of what I'm envisioning for area number 3, because as they all sort of cluster around this delta, I was looking at the Hohokam in the Sonora Desert, where, as I understand it, there are these sort of irrigation communities where particular kinship groups live around a shared waterway. That's kind of what I was going for, or what I'm envisioning for number 3, and that will, with the higher population density, that'll kind of it necessarily implies that kinship groups are sort of interacting with one another in a fairly close proximity.
Yes, and especially if they're doing a lot of fishing, and with fishing there could be boats. The groups that go fishing together may not necessarily be kin groups, especially as you start getting more and more clans and compounds interacting with one another. So the fishing group may be another distinct social unit of organization. And they could actually apply their pretense for like adding pieces of flair to architecture to the boats. So each of these boats could have their own like designs and aesthetic to them, because and especially if it is the men who are doing a lot of this fishing, maybe each boat is commanded by what is it, like a bachelorette, a woman who is not a clan mother yet. Then a way for them to kind of compete for status to maybe get up in the queue could be to have their boat be the most successful fishing boat, and kind of bag some really big sea creatures.
Wow, yeah, because
so like
the males do have this kind of the kind of gimmick of the neotets is that they evolved from species where the primary way that the males competed with each other was through making the nest, and so therefore that's sort of translated into this drive in the modern neotets to one of the primary ways that the males express themselves and gain status is by essentially not just architecture, but just sort of artistic and creative endeavors in general. And they are very keen to try and set themselves and their own work apart from other males. So I imagine that a lot of the settlements will look like this weird pastiche where you've got all these different males that all have their own ideas about what their particular signature style of construction and architecture is, all kind of conglomerated together.
And that can also work on like a smaller level, even with the weapons that they're using. So in certain hunter-gatherer cultures, each person in a hunting party, usually men, but each person in a hunting party had their own. They fletch their arrows differently, and the purpose of this was actually every member of the hunting party would exchange arrows. So your quiver would be full of arrows from different people, and
Oh.
that meant it wasn't the person who loosed the arrow that killed the animal that got the credit.
Mm,
It was the arrow that killed the animal. The
right.
owner of the arrow got the credit. And the reason why that's interesting is that that was a institution that they created in order to make sure that like the best hunter may be killing the most animals, but the credit is spread out to everyone who's in the hunting party.
Wow.
Um, so like so and the neotechs don't have to do this, but they could say it's like, oh well, I know they're not very good at throwing, but if they're going after their version of a white whale, and they develop some kind of technology that they can use to harpoon it in some way. They may have their own very colorful harpoons they spend a long time carving and painting and things. And when they drag it
Mm.
to shore, they can see how many of their harpoons stick in as a way to gain status and to compete with one
Wow, yeah.
another. And it's those kinds of, um, and I think we talked about this a little bit before the stream, but it's what you're trying to do is trying to take their social logic for how they engage with one another. In this case, their pieces of flair and their artistic and creative expression and trying to gain status, and how it can be, and how it kind of like a liquid, it can fill different niches as their
Sure.
society changes. Um,
Because what I
and
really don't want to do
Mhm.
is, because I've been guilty of this a little bit in the past as well, is to assume a sort of rigidity in the way that their society functions. Based, they do have this sort of starting point of what their ancestral condition was, but that will be there's definitely flexibility there. It might
Yeah.
have like lingering remnants in the way that they organize themselves, but there's not going to be like I this is you see this in like fantasy and science fiction a lot of the sort of the monolith
Yeah.
race or the planet of hats where there's like one entire species has a single sort of monoculture with a singular sort of gimmick, the one thing that they do, and I really don't want to do that.
And that's often applied to like humans as well. Like there's
Mm,
ideas of what human nature is, and these ideas can be based in sort of this biological determinism by comparing it to say chimps, for example. But I mean, we're also equally related to bonobos, and
mm,
primatologists have pointed out how different primates and relatives like old world monkeys have a variety of different social systems and organizations. And we can point out that like humans were egalitarian hunter gatherers for by and large, for hundreds of thousands of years before, starting to engage with different like hierarchical and hierarchical political organizations. So it's like, is the kind of hierarchical, individualistic, competitive societies that we in the West, we being me, live in now, um, nature, or was the egalitarian foraging way of life that we had for hundreds of thousands of years our human nature? And if that's the case, you know in either case, like, how do you explain the vast field of human experience and the ways that we've organized ourselves? So I do like to think of it as more of a field, and different technologies and different situations and different ways of organizing and kind of structure and produce different effects. And of course, the neotechs, being like fundamentally different creatures, are going to have their
mm.
own predilections. For example, they'll probably really, really want to have these, close social groups and these kinds of things.
Yeah,
But how that expresses itself in these different environments and situations that they create, um, and they kind of feed back into each other, could be super cool. Um,
yeah.
and I know we only talked about three a bit, but for the transient ones in number one, I think you could apply a similar thing to the boats. To Like if they're very transient and they're moving around, they could organize themselves to a degree around um, like wagons, or and that could become their uh, like their mobile kind of compound or their mobile home, and that's something that we see in the steppe, for example, and
Yeah.
some of the chariot talk with the introduction of wagons and ox-pulled wagons. So that kind of gets into domestication a bit. Um, it seems like wheeled vehicles may have been human-powered before animals were attached to them. But on the other hand, it may have been that it was the animal that then gave rise to the. I think there perhaps like a travois or something like that was used.
I was going to say, I don't know how it's
Yeah,
pronounced, but is it travois or travois or something else entirely?
travois. I mean, but yeah, and a travois is like essentially two sticks that are
You
kind of
just drag along.
crossed, and then you wrap a bag or a platform between the two sticks, and you're able to like put stuff on it and drag it behind you. And it's very useful when you're on relatively flat land, but you don't have roads. And what's very cool about them is that indigenous peoples use them on the plains here, North America, Turtle Island, and um, and humans pulled them, but they had dogs. So dog pulled travois existed before the introduction of horses, and then they used the horses to pull the travois, and this allowed them to actually build larger structures and carry those larger structures with them.
And that, yeah, the whole equation will definitely change once we get into domestication and once agriculture actually kicks off. And there are a lot of potential directions that we can take that in. Unfortunately, we are running very low on time, and I do have a stream immediately after this one. Yeah, so I would love to stay and chat. But these are some really good ideas. I do love the idea of the boat fortress compounds and the competitive whaling, essentially. That's very fun. So there's a lot of fun directions that I can go with the info you've given me. So thank you very much for this sort of personalized lecture, and for the help with the map as well. That was very, very happy with how things have turned out. Thank you very much for tuning in, everyone. And shall I just bounce out and leave you to wrap things up?
Yeah, you can bounce out, and I think for your video prior to the development of agriculture or domestication and things, the polities you want to focus on are all of like the different networks that they'd have, or the different groups they'd organize themselves within. Yeah, and thank you so much. I was really excited when you reached out. I mean, I've been watching alien biospheres for 5 years, so the opportunity to help you out with the climate map and to introduce you to some of these concepts from the social sciences that I work on in my own research. I do a lot of work around state formation. Was very cool. And to be able to share it with everyone during the Worldbuilding Festival was awesome.
Yeah, it's very good to have an actual expert to help out with these things, because, as I say, I have no confidence in my ability to actually convey these in any kind of way that makes sense to anyone but me. Well, thank you again. Yes, Jake is summoning me. I am needed to talk to them about ratites, among other things.
The link to the next stream is in the description of the stream right now, so y'all can start hopping over there. This is my new channel, Lands Unknown. If you'd like more social science informed world building, you can give me a like and a subscribe. I had a whole stream on chariots yesterday where I introduced Dove, which is the code name for the project I'll be working on this stream. I also included Bibliaridion's channel as well as his Patreon, so you can head over there and support him.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I also have on my own Ko-Fi, doing the research and putting this stuff together to share it is really fun, but any support that helps, continuing academic career, and doing world building on the side would be really helpful.
Very good. I'll head off now, and you've got like 30 seconds left to yourself, so thank you very much again, and I'll see everyone momentarily to talk about flightless birds.
Yeah, see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Yeah, we've got about 10 more seconds. Thank you everyone who attended. That was a really fun stream. Bye Seb, bye Galley Girl. Boom.